Sometimes it's not the storms outside, but the quiet battles within that shape who we become. Welcome to Vale Marks, where every story leaves behind a mark, sometimes tender, sometimes raw, but always real. In today's video, you'll witness a tale of a broken pit bull, a father's silent devotion, and a little girl who saw light where others saw danger. This isn't just a story, it's a mirror of love, pain, and redemption. Please stay with us until the end. The lesson tucked into the final moments may just stay with you longer than the story itself. As the old saying goes, the heart remembers what the eyes forget. In a forgotten corner of old Brooklyn, tucked between a crumbling warehouse and a row of tired brick houses, stood a small, weary home with a rusted mailbox that read, E. Carter. The siding peeled like sunburned skin, the roof sagged under years of neglect, and ivy crept up the brick chimney like it was trying to hold the place together. The house wasn't much, not to most people, but inside it breathed warmth, the kind built from laughter, habit, and the stubborn rhythm of love that refused to die. Eli Carter, 42, worked as a part-time plumber. He wasn't always a man of few words, but grief has a way of folding people into themselves. His hands, cracked and calloused from years of wrenching bolts and sealing leaks, moved with surprising tenderness when he tied his daughter's shoes or tucked her hair behind her ear. Life had changed forever the day his wife, Marie, passed away from cancer, an ache that still haunted the quiet corners of their home like a ghost who wouldn't move on. Now it was just Eli and his daughter, Grace, 6 years old, with big, wondering eyes and an imagination as vast as the night sky. Grace had been diagnosed with a mild developmental disorder a year ago. She repeated phrases softly to herself, got her days confused sometimes, and found comfort in routine. But what she lacked in clarity, she made up for in presence. Every wall in their home bore her fingerprint, crayon stars in the hallway, glitter stickers stuck unevenly on cabinets, a faded construction paper rainbow that still hung above the sink. There was magic between them, the kind that doesn't come from perfect parenting or well-spoken I love yous, but from the way Eli gently reminded Grace which shoe went on which foot, and the way she waited for him each morning on the porch, 2 cups of lukewarm instant cocoa steaming beside her. They had rituals. Mornings began with cereal and counting pigeons on the power lines, each bird with a name and a backstory Eli invented on the fly. Grace would giggle and ask if birds had birthdays, and he'd nod like it was gospel. Nights were sacred. Before bed, she'd point to the glowing plastic stars on her ceiling, and Eli would retell the story behind each one. "This one," he'd whisper, "is the night you danced in the rain, and this one's from your first real smile." They didn't have much, but they had that. Their home stood across from a shuttered paint factory. The scent of rust and old oil lingered in the air, and at night, the wind moaned through the gaps in boarded-up windows. Around them, the neighborhood had hollowed out, empty stoops, cracked sidewalks, the occasional flicker of a television through a yellowed curtain. But despite the fading world around them, Eli had created a space that pulsed with intention. Grace's spelling test taped beside the fridge, the grocery list scribbled with her drawings in the margins, a hand-me-down lamp that cast a warm circle where she liked to read the same 3 books over and over. Lately, times had gotten harder. Eli's plumbing gigs were drying up, and the only job left was an overnight shift fixing broken water lines in an old textile building downtown. It was dangerous and lonely work, but the paycheck meant 1 more week of groceries. He hated leaving Grace at night, even though their neighbor, Miss Judith, a retired school teacher with silver curls and a dry sense of humor, had agreed to watch her while he worked. Judith had always had a soft spot for Grace. She kept a drawer full of puzzles and warm milk ready, but still, Eli never felt fully at ease walking away. That night, the wind blew colder than usual, rattling the loose panes of the front window. Eli knelt beside Grace by the door. She clutched her stuffed rabbit, an old, one-eyed thing she called Mr. Buttons, with a grip that made his heart twist. Her pajamas were a size too small, fraying at the sleeves. Her braid had come undone on one side. "Be good for Miss Judith," Eli said, his voice low. "Be good," she echoed, nodding, her eyes soft and far away, like she was watching stars no one else could see. He kissed her forehead and stood slowly, the way a man does when he's reluctant to turn his back on the only thing he has left. The door clicked shut behind him. He paused on the porch, the cold air biting through his jacket, and looked back once more at the window, where Grace had already disappeared from view. Something in the night felt off. Not wrong exactly, but hollow. Like the world had exhaled and forgotten to inhale again. Eli didn't know it then, but this would be the night everything changed. The night the stars Grace adored would slip just out of reach, and something else, something wild and loyal and unexpected, would rise to take their place. Rain fell soft like a lullaby over the rooftops of Brooklyn, casting the neighborhood in a sheen of silver and gray. It was the kind of rain that whispered rather than stormed, that crept in during the night and settled into the cracks of broken sidewalks and leaky gutters. The city was still asleep when Grace Carter stirred beneath her blanket, her small body curled like a comma around her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Buttons. The knock came again, faint, deliberate. Not a hand on a door, but the gentle tap-tap-tap of something outside her window. She opened her eyes, blinking at the shadowy shapes across her ceiling, the familiar outlines of glow-in-the-dark stars. Another tap, then a chirp. A bird. Grace slipped quietly from her bed, her pink pajama pants dragging over her heels. She tiptoed past Miss Judith's quiet snores on the living room recliner, her tiny arms wrapped around a pillow, and a single chocolate chip cookie she'd taken from the tin labeled "just in case." She'd been told not to open the back door alone, but tonight felt different. Something was out there, calling. She pushed the door open slowly. The rain kissed her face, and the world outside shimmered in that strange quiet that only comes before dawn. Barefoot, she stepped onto the slick porch, the boards cool and damp beneath her. Her breath came out in small clouds. She didn't shiver. She didn't hesitate. She walked. Unseen from the shadows, he watched her. A large Pitbull stood at the edge of the alley behind the house, his broad chest barely rising as he breathed. Rain ran down the ridges of old scars etched deep into his muscular neck, remnants of a life that had not been kind. No collar, no tags. Just a wide, powerful stance, and the kind of stillness that came from learning long ago how not to be seen. He had no name in this neighborhood, but if one were to assign him something, it would be Diesel. Diesel moved when she moved, not behind her and not ahead, beside, like a whisper, like a shadow. He made no sound, only adjusted his pace to match the barefoot child wandering into the wet, sleeping city. Grace walked with the focus of someone following music only she could hear, her gaze flitting upward between the rain-blurred streetlights and the overhanging trees, her small face tilted to the sky. She clutched her cookie in one hand and the pillow in the other, murmuring softly to herself about birds, stars, and something called sky nests. Diesel didn't understand the words, but he understood the moment. Each time a car passed in the distance, he subtly shifted, steering her body away with the angle of his stance. When she veered toward the main road, he nudged her gently back with his flank. When a pair of headlights appeared at the far end of the block, he froze, muscles coiled like a spring, positioning himself between her and the danger. They moved like this for nearly an hour, a child and a dog, one in pajamas, the other wearing the weight of the street on his back. To anyone watching, it might have looked like a scene from a dream. The girl in faded pink pajamas, curls plastered to her face by rain, trudging through puddles with a calm not quite of this world. And the Pitbull, all muscle and instinct, his eyes scanning every darkened doorway, every shifting shadow. They found a fallen tree in a lot 2 blocks from the house. The trunk had collapsed during last winter's storm, but it still stood at an angle, propped by a rusted fence. From its highest limb, a nest dangled just out of reach, rocking gently in the rain. Grace beamed. "Sky nest," she whispered. She tried to climb the base of the trunk, but the bark was slick with moss and water. Diesel watched silently. He stepped forward just as she slipped, catching her not with his body but with his presence, blocking her from the sharp branch jutting near the ground. She laughed as if it were all part of the game. She sat down beside him, pillow-soaked now, cookie half-eaten, and looked up. He sat too, close, but not touching, eyes up, still. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something deeper than fear, but not yet trust. It was proximity. It was shared silence. A man passing by on his morning jog slowed when he saw them, the strange pair caught in the blue haze of rain and street lamp glow. "Hey, sweetheart, are you okay?" he asked, voice careful, unsure. Grace looked up, blinking, but before she could respond, Diesel rose like thunder. A deep, guttural growl rolled from his chest, low and deliberate. He didn't lunge, he didn't snarl. He stood, planted, warning. The jogger froze, hands raised, eyes wide. "Whoa, okay, easy, big guy," he said, backing away. Diesel didn't pursue. He just waited until the man had disappeared into the rain before returning to his spot beside Grace. The girl hadn't flinched. She looked at Diesel the way one might look at an old tree or a mountain. Something eternal. Something that didn't need explaining. "You're not a bad dog," she said softly. "You're a good one." Diesel said nothing, but the rain slowed. The world lightened. And somewhere deep in the city, a father awoke to a nightmare, unaware that his daughter was out in the dawn, not alone, but not yet safe. Abigail Hayes didn't need an alarm clock. She woke with the sun, like she had for the past 15 years. The mornings in the old Brooklyn district were quiet, aside from the low hum of city buses rolling down cracked streets and the distant bark of dogs echoing off concrete walls. Her home, an aging one-story house tucked at the far end of the neighborhood, stood behind an overgrown fence and a mailbox that hadn't seen a letter in years. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The kitchen smelled of stale coffee and dog food. Abigail sat at the wooden table nursing a chipped mug. The soft groan of her joints greeted the morning as she watched the light spill through the window. The same view, the same silence. A life lived with as little disruption as possible. 15 years ago, Abigail had been someone else entirely. She was a decorated military dog trainer, tough, precise, and fiercely proud. She had a husband, Nathan, who used to sing off-key in the shower, and a daughter, Claire, who loved peanut butter sandwiches and drew rainbows on every scrap of paper she could find. Then came the fire. A short circuit, the report said. Something electrical. It started in the basement and moved too fast. Abigail had been away, just one night, leading a training session in upstate New York. By the time she returned, all that remained was ash and a hollow shell of a life she no longer recognized. Since then, she hadn't spoken much. Not to her neighbors. Not even to herself, really. She filled the silence with dogs. Strays. Abandoned. Damaged, like her. She never gave the house a name, but the neighborhood kids whispered about the dog woman at the end of the block. Sometimes, someone left a cardboard box at her gate. Inside would be a trembling pup, hungry and wet. She took them in, trained them when she could, let them stay when she couldn't find them a home. She didn't ask questions. She didn't expect answers. This morning felt like all the others, until she saw the girl. Through the fogged glass of the kitchen window, Her eyes caught an unusual sight across the field that stretched beyond her yard. A small figure stood near the overgrown lot, pink pajamas vivid against the gray morning. Next to her, a large dog, thick-necked, muscular, unmistakably a Pitbull, stood stiff, alert, like a statue carved from shadow. Abigail blinked, unsure if grief had finally conjured ghosts. She set down her mug and moved to the porch, her steps careful, her breath caught somewhere between curiosity and old instinct. The girl couldn't have been older than 6, barefoot, her tiny hands holding a soggy pillow. Her eyes scanned the bushes, as if looking for something. A bird, perhaps. Her lips moved, but Abigail couldn't hear her voice. The Pitbull stood between the girl and the world. His presence wasn't just protective. It was deliberate, controlled. Abigail recognized the body language instantly. Squared stance, ears flicking toward sound, weight shifted forward just enough to spring if needed. Not astray. Not entirely. When Abigail stepped off the porch, the dog growled. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to stop her mid-step. His amber eyes locked with hers. There was no fear in them, only warning, and something else. Recognition. Abigail knew that look. She had trained that look. A dog that had been taught not just to obey, but to think, to assess, to protect. She raised her hands slowly, keeping her voice level. "Easy there, soldier," she whispered. The Pitbull didn't relax, but he didn't advance either. He turned his head slightly toward the girl, who now sat on a patch of dry grass, brushing dirt from her pillow. Abigail looked from the child to the dog, then back again. Something was wrong. A child this young shouldn't be alone in a place like this, barefoot in the cold with no adult in sight. And this dog. This wasn't a coincidence. Dogs didn't just appear like this, not unless they were following a scent or a purpose. She stepped back, retreating slowly to her porch, never turning her back. The dog watched her go, then resumed scanning the field. He hadn't come here by accident. Neither had the girl. And Abigail, whether she was ready or not, was part of this now. Inside her house, she reached for her phone. Her fingers hesitated above the screen. Who would she even call? After all these years, she didn't have contacts or favors to pull. But she still remembered how to think like a trainer, how to recognize a mission in progress. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling dry leaves across the cracked sidewalk. Abigail stood at her window, eyes on the pair beneath the rising sun. She didn't know their story yet, but something deep in her gut, the part that still woke her in the night screaming Claire's name, told her this was no ordinary morning. Maybe, just maybe, this was where it started to change. For the first time in years, Abigail Hayes felt something stir beneath the weight of silence. Hope. The rain had long since stopped, leaving the streets slick with reflections of dim streetlights and early morning haze. Inside the small, weathered house at the edge of the block, the silence was broken only by the creak of the front door as Abigail stepped aside, motioning toward the hallway. "This is a safe place," she said softly, crouching to meet the eyes of the battle-scarred Pitbull. "I promise." Diesel didn't move. His thick, muscular frame remained planted firmly in front of Grace, his gaze locked on Abigail, as if analyzing her every breath, every twitch of her fingers. The old trainer in Abigail recognized it instantly. This was no untrained dog. This was a sentinel, intelligent, calculated, loyal beyond comprehension. She didn't push. Instead, she waited. Grace, still clutching her damp pillow, looked up at the dog. "It's okay," she murmured, placing a tiny hand on his back. Diesel gave a small grunt, then stepped forward with a quiet sigh of surrender. That night, Grace slept in the spare bedroom. once a place filled with dusty books and forgotten dog crates. Abigail had made it livable again in less than an hour. Guided by muscle memory she thought she'd buried years ago. The small girl curled under a wool blanket, still in her pink pajamas, as if sleep was simply a continuation of a dream. But Diesel didn't sleep. The old Pitbull positioned himself outside Grace's door, his large frame curled in the hallway like a guardian statue carved from flesh and muscle. His ears twitched at every creak of the old house, every gust of wind. His eyes never fully closed. Downstairs, Abigail sat in the dim glow of a single kitchen light, staring into her coffee as if trying to understand what had just entered her life. A girl, a dog, and something unspoken threading them together like fate. Miles away, Eli Harper's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel of his rusted van, eyes darting between empty sidewalks and shadowed alleyways. His voice was hoarse from calling Grace's name. Each hour that passed without a sign chipped away at his sanity. The moment he'd returned home after his night shift and found her bed empty, the front door ajar. His heart stopped. He hadn't even taken off his boots. He had run down the street shouting, pounding on neighbors' doors, calling the police, describing her pajamas, the way her speech sometimes looped in circles, how she couldn't tell north from south but loved birds and stars. Time had become his enemy. Every passing second stretched into an eternity, feeding the worst possibilities. By dawn, a patrol car had traced footage from a local traffic camera, an image of a small child walking alongside a large dog in the direction of the old rescue house. They gave Eli the address. He drove like a madman. When he arrived, he didn't even knock. He burst through the front gate, breath ragged, eyes wild. And Diesel was there. The dog appeared like a shadow in motion, placing himself firmly between Eli and the door. No growl this time. Just a quiet, immovable presence that spoke louder than any bark could. Abigail stepped out moments later, startled by the intrusion, but her instincts kept her calm. "She's safe," she said, hands raised. "She's inside." But Eli didn't hear her. He was already pushing forward, desperate to get to his daughter. Diesel blocked him again, his eyes unblinking, his stance wider, firmer. "What the hell?" Eli choked, his voice breaking. "That's my daughter." He stumbled back, defeated not by violence, but by the weight of his own fear. His legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the front steps, gasping for air, tears mixing with the dirt on his cheeks. "Grace!" he shouted, his voice cracking in the quiet morning. "Baby, it's Daddy! I'm here! Come out!" And then, from behind the screen door, came a voice so soft it felt like a dream. "It's okay, Daddy," Grace said. "He's a good dog." The silence that followed was deeper than anything Eli had ever known. The door creaked open. Grace stood there, her little fingers wrapped in Diesel's fur, her eyes calm, even reassured. The dog sat beside her, alert but no longer tense. The threat had passed. Eli rose slowly, his tears still falling. Abigail stepped aside. Grace walked out and into her father's arms. Eli dropped to his knees and held her, whispering apologies into her hair, hands trembling against her back. "I was so scared," he said. "I wasn't," she replied simply, resting her cheek on his shoulder. "Diesel was with me." And in that moment, Eli looked up at the dog, this fierce, scarred protector who had kept his daughter safe when he couldn't, and something inside him cracked open. He nodded, lips trembling. "Thank you," he whispered. Diesel didn't wag his tail. He didn't move. But in his eyes, there was something ancient and steady. Trust earned. A bridge crossed. They were still strangers, but they were now in the same house, and something had begun. The knock came just after noon, when the rain had settled into a soft, steady rhythm against the old tin roof. Abigail had been sitting in her faded armchair, a lukewarm mug of coffee forgotten in her hands, while Grace played quietly on the floor, building towers out of mismatched blocks. Diesel lay nearby, eyes half open but always alert, his massive head resting on his paws. When the knock came again, firmer this time, Diesel was on his feet instantly. He moved to the door like a shadow with muscle, posture rigid, growl low and steady in his throat. Abigail opened the door slowly, her body instinctively shielding the space behind her. Standing on the porch were two figures, a woman in a raincoat holding a clipboard, and a younger man with the calm demeanor of someone trained to stay composed when others couldn't. "Ms. Hayes?" the woman asked, flipping open the folder. "I'm Lorna Fielding, Department of Child Welfare. This is Officer Tay from Animal Control. We're following up on a report made early this morning." Abigail nodded cautiously. "Come in, but stay calm. There's a dog. He's protective." Diesel didn't bark, didn't lunge. He simply stood in front of Grace, unmoving, the same way he had when she wandered into Abigail's yard that morning. It was becoming a familiar posture. Grace looked up at the strangers with wide, uncertain eyes. She moved closer to Diesel, burying her face in his side. His tail didn't wag. He didn't move a muscle. "Is this the child reported missing?" Lorna asked, softening her voice. Abigail nodded. "Her father was here this morning. She's safe now." Lorna glanced at the girl, then at the dog. "That's not the issue. Mr. Wilson didn't report the child found. He assumed she was still lost. And this dog—" She turned a page in her file. "No license, no vaccination record, no documented ownership. We have to proceed according to protocol." Abigail's stomach dropped. "You're taking them?" "We have to separate them," Lorna said gently. "Temporarily. The child will be placed with a foster home while we conduct our assessment. The dog will be held at the city shelter for observation." Grace seemed to understand what was happening before any more words were said. "No," she whispered, standing quickly and hugging Diesel's thick neck. "No, you can't take him. He's my doggy." Diesel didn't growl this time. He just turned his head slightly, pressing his forehead gently against Grace's. It was a gesture that felt too human to be coincidence. "I'm sorry," Lorna said, though her voice betrayed no uncertainty. "We have to think about long-term safety. For everyone." Eli arrived just as the social worker began gently coaxing Grace toward the door. He was breathless, soaked from the rain, and looked like he hadn't slept in days. When he saw Grace, he ran to her, dropped to his knees, and hugged her so tightly she let out a small squeak. But Diesel stepped forward again, separating them slightly, not out of distrust, but habit. His instinct was always to protect. "She doesn't want to leave," Eli said, pleading with his eyes more than his voice. "And neither does he." Officer Tay stepped forward with a leash. "It'll be easier if the dog doesn't resist." Grace clung to Diesel, sobbing now. "No! No! He found me! He helped me!" Diesel growled again, not at anyone in particular, but at the situation, as if even he could sense the injustice in it. But when Abigail knelt beside him, placing a steady hand on his shoulder, he fell silent. "You saved her," she whispered into his fur. "But I need you to trust me now, just for a little while." The next moment felt frozen in time. Officer Tay clipped the leash gently onto Diesel's collar. Grace was lifted into Lorna's arms, her cries filling the room like thunder. Diesel tried to follow, pulling hard against the leash. It took both Abigail and the officer to hold him back. The door closed behind Grace, and Diesel let out a sound Abigail would never forget. Not a bark, not a growl, but a howl laced with heartbreak. He lunged toward the door once more, then stopped. His massive body shook, not from fear or cold, but from something deeper, older. The pain of being separated from the only soul he had chosen to protect. Outside, the rain intensified. Eli stood in the driveway, helpless, watching the car disappear down the road. His daughter's face was pressed against the window, one hand lifted toward the glass, the other still holding the stuffed elephant she had carried with her everywhere since her mother's passing. And Diesel, defeated, soaked, silent, leaned into Abigail's arms as she knelt beside him on the porch. The rain poured around them. She didn't try to lead him inside. She simply stayed with him, one hand on his back, her voice low and steady. "I know what it feels like to lose your person," she whispered, "but she's not gone. Not forever." As the street fell quiet again, only the soft tapping of rain on metal remained. Abigail and Diesel sat like two old scars, open again, exposed, but not alone. And though neither spoke, the promise was there. This wasn't the end. Not for Grace, not for Diesel, not for the love that had found them all in the most unexpected way. The rain hadn't stopped in days. It tapped gently on the windows of Abigail's little house like the quiet knock of memories, ones she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. But the photo of Grace on the kitchen table, eyes wide, smile crooked, refused to let her look away. Diesel hadn't eaten since the girl was taken. He barely moved. He lay curled beneath that table, breathing slow, as if the weight of the world had finally crushed him. Abigail watched him for a long while, her coffee turning cold in her hands. The silence between them had grown heavier, and in it, questions began to grow like weeds. She reached for her old military records that night, folders long buried beneath other things she didn't dare revisit. Most were from her years in training programs, thick with assessments, medical clearances, behavior logs. And then she saw it, a name scribbled in the corner of a faded photo. Diesel, Class 7, Unit K9 Rehab Program, Fort Trenton. Her fingers trembled. It was him. Younger, less scarred, eyes still bright but cautious. She remembered that gaze now, how he never barked like the others, how he always looked first before he moved. A smart one, sensitive, even gentle. But he'd been taken from the program when an incident occurred. Another dog attacked a handler, and Diesel had intervened aggressively. Though he hadn't started it, the label "dangerous temperament" was slapped onto his record, and just like that, he vanished from the base. She never thought she'd see him again. Digging deeper, Abigail followed trails of public records, rescue logs, even shady breeder auctions. It took days, calls, and the help of a friend still in animal control. But the truth was worse than she imagined. After being discharged, Diesel was purchased by a private kennel owner. That man, now facing charges, ran an underground dog-fighting ring in the outskirts of Pennsylvania. Diesel had been trained not with treats and praise, but with chains, beatings, starvation, fear. The scars on his neck weren't from the army. They were from survival. He had escaped that hell. No one knew how, just that he'd been spotted wandering weeks later in an abandoned warehouse district in Pittsburgh, too smart to be caught by anyone, too loyal to bite. Until one rainy morning, he saw a little girl in pink pajamas. Abigail pressed her hand against her mouth, her throat closing tight. She went to Diesel that night, knelt beside him. "You remembered me, didn't you?" she whispered. Diesel didn't move, but his eyes opened, slowly, then met hers with a weight that said more than any bark ever could. That's when she knew. She couldn't let him be forgotten again. Eli was the first to join her. He didn't even hesitate when Abigail told him. "We're bringing him home," she said. Together they started small, a single post on a community board. "Diesel is a hero. He saved my daughter. Now they've taken him away. Help us bring him back." Then came the pictures. Grace and Diesel under the old oak tree. Grace asleep with Diesel watching her, eyes alert. Grace drawing a picture labeled "Me and My Best Dog." It spread like wildfire. Soon Abigail's porch was stacked with printed signs. Eli's phone buzzed constantly. Former soldiers who'd trained dogs, mothers of children with therapy animals, Pitbull rescue advocates, even quiet neighbors who'd never spoken up before. All came together under one phrase: Pitbulls are family too. They held a peaceful protest outside the county shelter, not with shouting, but with candles and photos. One woman brought her own rescued pit bull and tied a note around its neck. "He saved me from myself." A retired vet brought his service dog and said Diesel reminded him of the dog who saved his life in Afghanistan. Local news picked up the story. Then state news. A week later, an online petition had crossed 150,000 signatures. Even Grace, who was still under temporary supervision, managed to speak a few words during a supervised visit. "He's my best friend," she said, clutching her little drawing. "He made the scary go away." The turning point came at a review hearing. The judge, a reserved man in his 60s, reviewed Abigail's findings, the military records, the documentation of Diesel's trauma, and the unprecedented support from the community. But it was Diesel's presence that shifted the room. Abigail had asked for special permission to bring him, not into the courtroom, but to the therapy center nearby. There, Diesel saw Grace's picture taped on the wall, the one she'd drawn on the first day they were separated. He walked up to it slowly, sniffed the paper, then sat beneath it and didn't move. Not for an hour. Not even when others tried to coax him away. Abigail captured the moment on video. It went viral. The next morning, the ruling came. Diesel was officially recognized as a rehabilitated therapy dog under supervised care. He would return home. Abigail wept openly. So did Eli. So did the receptionist at the vet's office. That night, as Diesel stepped through the door of Abigail's house once more, he paused. Then slowly, he walked over to the table, where Grace's drawing still sat. He lay beside it, curled up tight. Abigail knelt beside him and whispered again, "This is your home now. No one will hurt you here." His ear twitched. Then, for the first time since Grace was taken, Diesel wagged his tail. Not fast, but enough. And that was everything. The late spring sun cast a golden hue over the once faded fence that separated Abigail's yard from the alleyway. The wood had been freshly painted white, and on it bloomed strokes of color. A small bird, mid-flight, its wings outstretched toward a sky only a child could imagine. Grace stood in front of it, a stubby paintbrush in hand, her pink sundress streaked with blues and greens. She tilted her head, squinting at the wings she had drawn, then dipped her brush again with quiet confidence. Below her, stretched out comfortably in the grass, lay Diesel. His body, once rigid with distrust, was now at ease, his ears twitching lazily with the breeze. Occasionally his eyes would open halfway, just enough to glance up at Grace, then settle shut again. The scar on his neck remained, a permanent mark of the life he'd escaped, but his presence now held none of the shadows that had once clung to it. He was her protector, her guardian, and now, her friend. Abigail stood nearby, her knees deep in the flower bed that wrapped around the base of her porch. She wore a wide-brimmed hat, and her gloved hands moved with ease as she trimmed a patch of lavender, the scent trailing softly on the wind. Her yard, once wild and overgrown with neglect, had begun to bloom again, much like the woman who tended it. From the kitchen came the sound of a kettle whistling. Moments later, Eli stepped out onto the porch carrying a tray, 2 glasses of iced tea, a plate of warm cornbread, and a box of chocolate milk with a straw. He looked healthier now. The permanent exhaustion that once carved lines into his face had eased, and while the weight of responsibility still sat on his shoulders, it was no longer crushing. "This is home now, right?" he asked, setting the tray down and stretching his arms with a soft sigh. Grace turned toward him, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear with paint-stained fingers. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him, her eyes lingering, then glanced at Diesel, at Abigail, at the little bird she had just painted, her version of the robin that had tapped on her window that night. She nodded once. "Yeah, Daddy," she said, her voice steady. "This is home." The simplicity of her words hit Eli harder than he expected. He walked over, crouched beside her, and kissed the top of her head. She leaned into him gently, resting her small hand on his arm. Diesel stirred, rose to his feet, and nudged his head between them, demanding his place in the hug. The two humans laughed, their arms encircling the dog who had once stood alone in the rain, ready to defend a little girl he didn't know. It hadn't been easy getting here. There were hearings, evaluations, and long talks with caseworkers. Eli had to prove he could create a stable environment for Grace. Regular work hours, support systems, therapy. Abigail had volunteered to be their official support guardian, a role she took seriously but with quiet warmth. She had offered not just her home, but her heart. For the first time in over a decade, she was letting people in again. Diesel, now fully licensed and registered as an emotional support dog, had his own papers. The Pitbull's Our Family Too campaign had done more than just help him. It changed local laws, sparked conversations, and built a bridge between misunderstood animals and the humans who needed them most. His photo, sitting beside Grace as she read a picture book in the shelter, had gone viral. But here, in this quiet little yard, he was just Diesel. The dog who guarded the night, chased squirrels in the morning, and waited patiently outside the bathroom door every time Grace brushed her teeth. As the sun lowered behind the buildings, casting long shadows over the cracked sidewalks, a breeze picked up. The leaves rustled above them, and the smell of lavender and fresh earth lingered. Abigail stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She poured the tea and passed a slice of cornbread to Eli. "Feels like we've all been walking through different storms," she said, handing the chocolate milk to Grace. "But somehow, we landed here." Eli nodded. "Together." Grace took a sip of her milk and looked up. "Do you think the bird I painted will stay?" "I think it already has," Abigail said softly. They sat like that for a while, 3 humans and 1 dog, on a porch that now felt like it had always been theirs. It wasn't a grand ending, no fireworks, no music swelling in the background. Just the soft hum of healing, the sound of a child giggling when Diesel sneezed, and the gentle thump of his tail against the porch floor. Later that night, Grace would fall asleep with Diesel curled up beside her bed, one paw gently touching her blanket. Eli would check on them before turning in, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Abigail would water her plants one last time before heading inside, pausing at the fence to admire the little bird again. And the stars, those unreachable lights Grace used to ask about, would shimmer quietly above them all. They hadn't moved. They hadn't come closer. But down here, something brighter had finally landed. Home. If you've stayed with us until this final scene, thank you. You've walked through the cold rain of Brooklyn streets, felt the ache of a father's worry, and seen through the gentle eyes of a misunderstood pit bull named Diesel. This story isn't fiction for some. It's a reflection of countless souls forgotten by society, human or not. And yet, as Abigail once said with tears in her voice, sometimes all a soul needs to heal is to be seen and not feared. Here at Vale Marks, we believe stories like these deserve to be told and retold until the world learns to look past scars, past breed labels, past silence, and into the heart. If this story moved you, even a little, leave a comment. Share your thoughts, your memories, or just say, "I saw him too." And please, subscribe to Vale Marks. Every single subscriber brings this small channel closer to reaching 1,000. And every one of you is the reason we keep creating stories that aren't just entertaining, but healing. As Maya Angelou once said, people will forget what you said, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. Let this story be a feeling you carry forward.